I had sworn never to love a client, yet here I stood in my dimly lit séance room, my heart racing as Lord Sebastian Blackthorne entered with all the bearing of a man who had never needed to ask for anything twice. The October rain hammered against the windows of my Mayfair townhouse, and I knew with the certainty that comes from communing with the dead that this man would be my undoing. 3 years had passed since I established myself as London's most sought-after medium. 3 years since I built these walls around my heart after Charles Worthington discovered my gifts and fled our engagement in horror. I had learned to read the grief in a widow's eyes, to recognize the desperate hope in a mother's trembling hands, to maintain that crucial distance between myself and those who sought comfort from beyond the veil. My reputation was built on 2 pillars that seemed contradictory to most: genuine ability and emotional detachment. I never promised more than the spirits would give, and I never, ever allowed myself to care too deeply for those who sat across from me in the séance circle. Lord Blackthorne was different from the moment he crossed my threshold. Where most clients came to me suffused with hope or desperation, he radiated skepticism and barely contained fury. His dark eyes held no belief in what I did, only a grim determination that spoke of a man who had exhausted all other options. He was tall, perhaps 35, with the kind of harsh beauty that comes from suffering worn without surrender. His black mourning clothes were impeccable, but I noticed the slight tremor in his gloved hands, the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Your letter mentioned your wife," I said, gesturing for him to take the chair across from the round table where I conducted my sessions. The room was deliberately kept simple, without the theatrical trappings many of my competitors employed. No crystal balls or mysterious symbols, just a plain wooden table, comfortable chairs, and the soft glow of gaslight filtered through green glass shades. I had found that genuine spirits needed no dramatics to make their presence known. "Catherine died 3 years ago," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "The authorities ruled it suicide. She fell from the east tower of Blackthorne Manor during a storm much like this one. They said she jumped, but I know my wife, Miss Ashwood. Catherine would never have taken her own life. She was murdered, and I have spent every day since trying to prove it." I studied his face in the gaslight, noting the way his jaw clenched when he spoke her name. Many clients came to me with similar stories, unable to accept the truth of their loved ones' deaths. But there was something in Lord Blackthorne's certainty that resonated with the part of me that could sense the unsettled dead. The air in the room had grown thick the moment he mentioned Catherine's name, and I felt the familiar chill that preceded a spiritual manifestation. "You don't believe in what I do," I observed, keeping my voice neutral. "Yet you're here." He leaned forward, his dark eyes boring into mine. "I believe in exhausting every possibility, Miss Ashwood. I've hired investigators, questioned every servant, examined every piece of evidence. The police have closed the case. Society has moved on. But I cannot, will not, until I know the truth. If there is even the slightest chance that Catherine's spirit lingers, that she can tell me what happened that night, then my skepticism is a luxury I can no longer afford." I had heard such speeches before, but something in his raw honesty moved me in a way I hadn't expected. I found myself wanting to help him, not for the generous fee he had offered, but because I recognized in him the same relentless need for truth that had driven me to develop my gifts, despite the cost to my social standing. "Very well," I said, removing my gloves and placing my hands flat on the table. "But I must warn you, Lord Blackthorne, the spirits do not always tell us what we wish to hear. Sometimes their messages bring more pain than comfort. Are you prepared for that possibility?" He removed his own gloves with deliberate precision, and I noticed his hands were artist's hands, long-fingered and elegant despite their strength. "I am prepared for anything, Miss Ashwood, if it brings me closer to the truth." I nodded and began my preparations, lighting the white candles I used to create a protective circle, adjusting the gaslight until the room was cast in a soft, ethereal glow. As I worked, I was intensely aware of his presence, the way he watched my every movement with those penetrating eyes. Most clients were nervous during these preparations, but Lord Blackthorne remained perfectly still, like a predator waiting to strike. "I need something of hers," I said, returning to my seat. "Something she wore often, or treasured. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a gold locket on a delicate chain. "She wore this every day," he said, his voice softening for the first time. "It contains a photograph of us on our wedding day." The moment my fingers closed around the locket, the room temperature plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the gaslights flickered violently. Lord Blackthorn started in his chair, but I raised my free hand to still him. This was stronger than anything I had experienced in months. Catherine Blackthorn was not merely present. She was desperate to communicate. I closed my eyes and opened myself to the spiritual plane, feeling the familiar sensation of stepping between worlds. The séance room faded, replaced by a swirling mist of images and emotions not my own. I saw a woman with golden hair and kind blue eyes, her face marked by a sadness that seemed to predate her death. But when she turned to me in the spiritual realm, her expression transformed into something I had never encountered before: recognition. "My lady," she whispered, and the words struck me like a physical blow. "My lady, you've finally come." I gasped, my eyes flying open to find Lord Blackthorn gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white with tension. The gaslights had gone out entirely, leaving only the candles to illuminate his face. Between us, above the table, a translucent figure materialized with a clarity I had never achieved before. Catherine Blackthorn stood there in the same white gown she had worn on the night of her death, water dripping from her hair as though she had just emerged from the storm. But she wasn't looking at her husband. Her ghostly eyes were fixed on me with an expression of profound relief and something else, something that looked impossibly like love. "Sebastian," she said, though her gaze never left my face, "you brought her to me at last. My dear sister, my true lady, the one who should have had everything I was given." Lord Blackthorn rose from his chair so violently it crashed to the floor. "What are you saying? Catherine, what do you mean?" The spirit turned to him then, and I saw tears of light streaming down her translucent cheeks. "The truth has been hidden for so long, my darling. But death frees us from the lies of the living. Eleanor is not who she believes herself to be. The blood that runs through her veins is the same that runs through yours, though diluted by shame and secrecy." I felt the world spinning around me, my carefully constructed life beginning to crumble. "No," I whispered, but even as I denied it, memories began to surface. Things my mother had said before her death when I was 12. Fevered ramblings about a great house, about a love that was forbidden, about a child who should have been a lady. "Your father's older brother," Catherine continued, her voice growing fainter as the manifestation began to fade. "The true Duke of Blackthorn, before he died in shame. Eleanor's mother was a governess, beautiful and accomplished, but still a servant. When she became pregnant, they sent her away with money and threats. But blood calls to blood, and I knew the moment I met Sebastian that one day you would come to claim what was yours." The candles flared suddenly, blindingly bright, and then Catherine was gone. The gaslights slowly returned to life, revealing Lord Blackthorn and me staring at each other across the table, like strangers who had suddenly recognized something familiar in each other's faces. His expression was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something else that made my heart constrict painfully in my chest. "You're my cousin," he said slowly, as though testing the words. "If what Catherine says is true, you're my cousin, and you should have been— God in heaven, you should have inherited everything. The title, the estate, it should all have been yours through your father." I stood on shaking legs, the locket still clutched in my hand. I needed to leave, to process what had just happened, to understand why Catherine's spirit had revealed this impossible truth. But as I moved toward the door, Lord Blackthorn caught my arm gently, his touch sending an unexpected warmth through me, despite the shock of revelation. "Please," he said, and I heard in his voice the same lost quality I felt in my own heart. "Don't go. Not yet. We need to understand this, and more importantly, we need to find out who killed her. Because if Catherine knew this secret, if she was trying to reunite us for a reason, then her death might be connected to your true identity." I looked up into his dark eyes and felt the walls I had built around my heart begin to crack. Everything I had believed about myself, about my place in the world, had just shattered. But in that moment, Standing in my séance room with the lingering chill of the spirit world still clinging to the air, I realized that Lord Sebastian Blackthorn was the only person in London who might understand what it meant to have your entire world unmade by a ghost's revelation. The rain continued to beat against the windows as I slowly nodded, knowing that my carefully ordered life as Eleanor Ashwood, medium of Mayfair, had just ended. What would emerge from its ruins I could not yet say, but I knew with the certainty that had guided me through 3 years of speaking with the dead, that Sebastian and I were now bound together by more than blood, more than Catherine's murder, more than the secrets that had been buried with generations of Blackthorns. We were bound by the truth that had been spoken from beyond the grave, and by the dangerous attraction I could already feel pulling between us, an attraction that was no longer just forbidden by class, but by blood itself. As I let him guide me to a chair, his hand still warm on my arm, I wondered if Catherine had known what she was setting in motion, if she had seen from her place among the spirits that some truths, once spoken, could never be buried again. The séance had ended, but I knew with a medium's instinct that the real haunting had just begun. Catherine had called me my lady, and in doing so, had awakened something that had been sleeping my entire life, something that whispered of destiny and desire, of birthright and betrayal, of a love that might be impossible, but felt as inevitable as death itself. I looked at the locket still in my hand, at the photograph of Sebastian and Catherine on their wedding day, and wondered if the dead woman had seen even then what would come to pass. The thought chilled me more than any ghost ever had, because if Catherine had known, if she had planned this moment from beyond the grave, then her murder was only the beginning of a story that had been 27 years in the making, a story written in blood and sealed with a ghost's blessing. "My name is Eleanor Ashwood," I said softly, meeting Sebastian's eyes with a courage I didn't feel. "But it seems that was never truly who I was meant to be." "No," he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "You were meant to be Lady Eleanor Blackthorn, and we're going to find out why someone wanted to keep you from that destiny badly enough to kill for it." The next morning arrived gray and forbidding, matching the turmoil in my soul as I stood before the mirror in my modest bedroom, trying to recognize myself in the reflection. The woman who stared back at me looked the same as she had yesterday, with her dark hair pinned severely back, her brown eyes that clients said could see through the veil, her simple black dress appropriate for a respectable medium. But I knew now that this was a costume, a character I had been playing without knowing I was on stage. Sebastian had left my house near midnight, but not before extracting a promise that I would come to Blackthorn Manor that very afternoon. "We need to search Catherine's rooms," he had said, his hand lingering on mine perhaps a moment longer than propriety allowed. "If she knew your secret, there might be evidence she left behind. And the servants might remember something about your father, about what happened 27 years ago." Now, as my maid helped me into my traveling cloak, I wondered what madness had possessed me to agree. Every instinct I had developed, every wall I had built, screamed against this venture. But stronger than my fear was the pull I felt, not just toward the truth of my identity, but toward Sebastian himself. When he had looked at me in the gaslight, when his fingers had brushed mine as he handed back Catherine's locket, I had felt something electric pass between us, something that had nothing to do with the spirit world and everything to do with the dangerous realm of the living heart. The journey to Blackthorn Manor took me through the increasingly wild countryside beyond London, past villages that grew smaller and more scattered as we approached the ancestral estate. I had hired a private carriage, not wanting to explain to anyone why Eleanor Ashwood, medium of Mayfair, was visiting the reclusive Lord Blackthorn. The driver had given me a strange look when I stated our destination, muttering something about the cursed towers and the lady who fell, but I was too lost in my own thoughts to pay much attention to local superstitions. As we rounded the final bend in the road, Blackthorn Manor rose before me like something from a Gothic novel, all dark stone and pointed towers reaching toward the brooding sky. The east tower, from which Catherine had fallen, stood slightly apart from the main structure, connected by a narrow bridge that looked precarious even from a distance. I shivered, pulling my cloak tighter, and wondered if Catherine's spirit lingered here as strongly as she had manifested in my séance room. Sebastian met me at the door himself, dismissing the butler with a wave of his hand. He looked as though he hadn't slept, shadows purple beneath his eyes, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. The sight of him made my heart contract with an emotion I refused to name. "You came," he said simply, taking my cloak with his own hands rather than calling for a servant. "I promised I would," I replied, trying to ignore how intimate this felt, standing in his entrance hall without the buffer of servants and society between us. "Have you discovered anything?" He led me through corridors lined with portraits that seemed to watch our passage with knowing eyes. "I've been in the library all night, searching through family records. My uncle, your father, was indeed the elder brother, William Blackthorne, 5th Duke of Blackthorne. The records show he died of a fever in India 27 years ago, just months after he allegedly left for a diplomatic position there. But Eleanor, I found something else. There are letters, coded references to a woman, initials only, M.A. Your mother?" "Margaret Ashwood," I confirmed, my voice barely a whisper. "She died when I was 12, told me on her deathbed that my father was a great man who couldn't acknowledge me. I thought she meant he was married, that I was merely the product of an affair. I never imagined that you were legitimate." Sebastian stopped before a heavy oak door, turning to face me fully. "Because I believe you were, Eleanor. I found a church registry, hidden in my uncle's personal effects, a secret marriage between William Blackthorne and Margaret Ashwood, conducted 3 months before his supposed departure to India. If this is real, you're not illegitimate at all. You're the rightful Duchess of Blackthorne." The implications crashed over me like a wave, and I had to grip the doorframe for support. But if that's true, then why? Why the deception? Why was I raised in poverty while my mother took in sewing to keep us fed? Sebastian's expression darkened. "Because someone wanted the title for themselves. My father was the younger brother. When William died without a recognized heir, my father inherited everything. He became the 6th Duke. I became his heir, and eventually I inherited the title and married Catherine, whose dowry saved the estate from the debt my father had accrued. But if you had been acknowledged, everything would have been mine," I finished, the words tasting strange on my tongue. "The title, the estate, the fortune, and Catherine would never have married into the family at all." We entered what had been Catherine's private sitting room, and immediately I felt her presence like a cool breath on my neck. The room was preserved exactly as she had left it, her embroidery still resting on a chair by the window, a book open on the side table, marked at a page she would never finish reading. But it was the portrait above the fireplace that stopped me cold, a wedding portrait of Catherine and Sebastian that must have been painted just months before her death. "She was beautiful," I said, unable to keep a note of something. Was it jealousy? From my voice. Sebastian moved to stand beside me, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something woody and masculine that made my pulse quicken. "She was," he agreed quietly. "But beauty wasn't enough to make our marriage happy. We were strangers who happened to share a house, bound by duty and economics rather than affection. I cared for her, tried to be a good husband, but there was no fire between us, no meeting of souls. She knew it as well as I did." I turned to look at him, finding his dark eyes already on me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "And did she know about me? Before last night, I mean?" He nodded slowly. "I think she did. About a month before she died, she became obsessed with family history, spending hours in the archive room, questioning the older servants about the previous generation. She mentioned once that the dead don't always stay buried, that sometimes they leave children behind to claim what was stolen. I thought she was referring to some Gothic novel she'd been reading. But now you think she was investigating my existence," I concluded, moving away from him toward Catherine's writing desk, needing distance from his magnetic presence. But why? What would she gain from exposing a secret that would invalidate her own marriage's legitimacy? Sebastian followed me, his reflection visible in the mirror above the desk. Perhaps she had her own reasons for wanting the truth revealed. Perhaps she knew something about her own death was coming. I opened the desk drawers, searching through Catherine's correspondence with hands that trembled slightly. Most of it was routine: invitations to social events, letters from friends, household accounts. But in the bottom drawer, Hidden beneath sheets of unused stationery, I found a leather journal bound with a black ribbon. The moment I touched it, the temperature in the room plummeted. The portrait above the fireplace seemed to shimmer, and for just a moment, I could have sworn Catherine's painted eyes moved to look directly at me. With shaking fingers, I untied the ribbon and opened to the first page. Catherine's handwriting was elegant and precise, but the words she had written were anything but calm. I know the truth about Eleanor Ashwood. The entry began, dated 6 weeks before her death. I have found the marriage certificate, the birth record, everything that proves she is the rightful heir to Blackthorn. More importantly, I know who murdered her father and why. The same person who will likely murder me when they discover what I've uncovered. Sebastian read over my shoulder, his breath warm against my cheek, his proximity making it difficult to concentrate on the words before me. "My God," he whispered. She knew she was going to die. I turned the pages with increasing urgency, reading Catherine's meticulous investigation into my father's death. She had discovered that William Blackthorn hadn't died of fever in India at all. He had never even left England. Instead, he had been poisoned slowly over the course of several months, arsenic administered in small doses that mimicked the symptoms of tropical disease. The physician who had attended him, Dr. Aldrich, had been paid handsomely to falsify the death certificate and had died himself in a carriage accident just weeks later. But it was the next entry that made my blood run cold. "The murderer still lives in this house," Catherine had written. "They walk these halls, eat at our table, smile at me each morning as though they haven't built their entire life on blood and lies. I have been watching, waiting, gathering proof, but they suspect me now. I see it in their eyes at dinner, feel their gaze following me through the corridors. I must act soon, must find Eleanor and bring her here before it's too late." "Who?" I demanded, turning pages frantically, searching for a name. Who did she suspect? But the entries grew increasingly erratic, speaking of shadows in the hallways, of footsteps following her, of tea that tasted bitter and food that made her ill. The final entry was dated the night of her death. "Tonight I confront them," she had written. "I have sent a letter to London, to the medium they say can truly speak with the dead. If something happens to me, perhaps my spirit can finish what my living body could not. Sebastian deserves to know the truth. He deserves to love freely, without the chains of a marriage built on murder. And Eleanor deserves to reclaim her birthright. If I die tonight, know that I die trying to right a terrible wrong." I closed the journal, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. "She knew," I said, my voice barely audible. "She knew she was going to be murdered, and she let it happen anyway. Why didn't she tell you? Why didn't she go to the authorities?" "Because she had no proof," Sebastian said, his hand coming to rest on my shoulder, the touch sending warmth through my entire body despite the cold that still gripped the room. "And because going to the authorities would have meant exposing your existence, putting you in danger before you could be protected. She sacrificed herself to set this in motion, to ensure we would meet, that we would investigate together." I turned to face him, finding myself trapped between his body and the desk, achingly aware of how close we stood. "Your wife died for me," I said. Tears I hadn't realized were forming, spilling down my cheeks. "A woman I never met gave her life so I could claim a birthright I never knew existed." Sebastian's hand came up to cup my cheek, his thumb brushing away my tears with infinite gentleness. "She died for justice," he corrected softly, "and perhaps for something more. That final entry, about me deserving to love freely. I think she knew, Eleanor. I think she saw what would happen between us." "What do you mean?" I asked, though my racing heart already knew the answer. His other hand came up to frame my face, and I saw in his eyes a hunger that matched the ache in my own chest. "I mean that from the moment you walked into your séance room, I felt something I had never experienced with Catherine, something I've been trying to deny all night. You're my cousin. It's forbidden, impossible. And yet I feel it too," I admitted, the words escaping before wisdom could stop them. "This pull between us that has nothing to do with ghosts or birthright or murder investigations. Sebastian, we can't—" But even as I spoke the denial, I was leaning into his touch, my hands coming up to rest against his chest where I could feel his heart beating as rapidly as my own. The portrait of Catherine watched from above the fireplace, and I could have sworn I saw approval in those painted eyes. A sudden crash from somewhere else in the house shattered the moment. Sebastian pulled away, instantly alert, his hand going to the pistol I hadn't noticed he carried in his jacket. "Stay here," he commanded, but I was already following him toward the door. "If the murderer is still in this house," I said, grabbing his arm, "then we face them together. Catherine brought us together for this purpose. We finish what she started." He looked at me for a long moment, something fierce and protective flashing in his eyes, then nodded. "Together, then. But Eleanor, if we're right, if the killer has been living here all along, then we're about to confront someone who has already murdered at least 3 people to keep this secret. Are you prepared for that?" I thought of my mother dying in poverty, of my father poisoned by someone he trusted, of Catherine falling through the storm last night, and felt a cold resolve settle over me like armor. "I've spent 3 years speaking for the dead," I said. "Now it's time to give them justice." We moved toward the door together, toward whatever danger awaited in the shadowed corridors of Blackthorn Manor. As we stepped into the hallway, I heard it clearly, the sound of footsteps running through the East Tower, the very place where Catherine had died. But there was something else, too, something that made every hair on my body stand on end. Laughter. Soft, feminine laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Laughter I recognized from the spirit world, though it had never sounded so corporeal before. "Catherine," I whispered, and Sebastian's hand found mine in the darkness, our fingers intertwining as we moved toward the tower where the dead woman's spirit seemed to be leading us, toward a confrontation 27 years in the making. The haunting had indeed only just begun, but now I understood that Catherine hadn't just brought Sebastian and me together to solve her murder. She had orchestrated this entire dance from beyond the grave to restore a birthright, to expose a killer, and perhaps most dangerously of all, to kindle a love that society would call an abomination. But that felt more real than anything I had ever experienced in my carefully controlled life. As we climbed the stairs toward the East Tower, following the ghostly laughter and the very human footsteps above us, I knew that whatever we found at the top would change everything. The medium of Mayfair was about to discover that some secrets are worth dying for, and some loves are worth defying heaven and earth to claim. The spiral staircase of the East Tower wound upward into darkness, each step echoing like a heartbeat in the confined space. Sebastian kept my hand firmly in his as we climbed, and I drew strength from his touch even as my mind reeled from the impropriety of it. The ghostly laughter had ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my ears. Above us, the footsteps had stopped as well, as though whoever or whatever we pursued was waiting for us at the top. The tower room door stood ajar when we reached it, candlelight flickering from within and casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Sebastian raised his pistol, positioning himself protectively in front of me, but I placed my hand on his arm and stepped forward. My gifts had always been strongest in moments of danger, when the veil between worlds grew thin, and I could feel Catherine's presence surrounding us like a cold embrace, urging me onward. We entered together to find a figure standing at the window where Catherine had fallen, their back to us, dressed in a dark cloak that made it impossible to determine their identity. The room itself was a study, lined with books and papers, though many appeared to have been recently disturbed, as though someone had been searching frantically through them. "I wondered when you would come," the figure said, and I recognized the voice with a shock that nearly drove me to my knees. It was Mrs. Blackwood, Sebastian's aunt, his father's sister who had lived at the manor for 40 years, managing the household since Sebastian's mother had died in childbirth. She turned slowly, and I saw she held a leather portfolio clutched to her chest, her usually composed face ravaged by sleepless nights and something that looked terrifyingly like madness. "Aunt Helena," Sebastian said, his voice hollow with disbelief. You? You killed Catherine?" She laughed, a bitter sound that bore no resemblance to the ghostly laughter we had heard earlier. "Catherine killed herself the moment she started digging into the past. Just as this one," she gestured at me with a trembling hand, "signed her own death warrant by coming here. The Blackthorn legacy was never meant for a bastard's daughter. I am no bastard, I said, stepping forward with a courage I didn't feel. You know the truth. My parents were legally married. My father was the rightful duke, and you helped murder him. Helena's composure cracked further, her refined features twisting into something ugly. Your father was a fool who would have destroyed everything with his radical ideas and his inappropriate marriage. He wanted to use the Blackthorn fortune for reform, for charity, for lifting up the very class of people he had degraded himself by marrying. My brother understood what needed to be done. The arsenic was my idea, but Thomas was happy enough to administer it once he understood what William's marriage meant for our family's future. You killed your own brother, Sebastian said, his voice rough with horror. My father knew? He was part of this? Helena's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. Your father was weak, just like you. He helped eliminate William, yes, but the guilt destroyed him. He drank himself to death trying to forget what we had done. And I've spent 30 years protecting this family from the consequences of his weakness, maintaining our position, ensuring the Blackthorn name remained untarnished. Then Catherine came along, clever little Catherine who couldn't leave well enough alone. The temperature in the room plummeted suddenly, and the candle flames turned an unnatural blue. Helena stepped back from the window as frost began forming on the glass, spreading in intricate patterns that looked almost like writing. I felt Catherine's presence growing stronger, feeding off the confession, drawing power from the truth finally being spoken aloud. She's here, I said softly. Catherine is here, and she wants you to continue. Tell us how you killed her. Helena's eyes darted around the room wildly, seeing things that weren't visible to normal sight, but I could see them. Shadows gathering in the corners, whispers of the wrong dead clustering close. Not just Catherine, but my father too, and the physician who had been silenced, and others, so many others, whose lives had been sacrificed to maintain a lie. She found the marriage certificate, Helena said, her voice rising in pitch. She found the birth record, the letters Margaret Ashwood had written to William before he died. She confronted me right here in this room, threatening to expose everything unless I helped her find Eleanor, bring her here, restore her inheritance. The stupid girl actually thought she was doing something noble, something romantic. She said Sebastian deserved to be free to find real love, that the marriage had been built on a crime and could never be happy. So you pushed her, Sebastian said, his pistol still trained on his aunt, though his hand shook visibly. Helena shook her head, backing further from the window as the frost continued to spread. I offered her tea first, laced with the same poison I had helped give William all those years ago. But she suspected, wouldn't drink it. We struggled. She tried to run, to get to you, but I couldn't let her. She was going to destroy everything I had protected for so long. She fell against the window. The latch was old. It gave way. And she fell. The storm did the rest, made it look like suicide. Everyone knew how melancholy she had been, how isolated. It was perfect until you started bringing in investigators, refusing to let it rest. And then Eleanor advertised her services in the Times, I said, understanding flooding through me. You couldn't resist checking if I was the daughter you had helped orphan. You came to me for a séance 6 months ago, under a false name, asking about a deceased brother. You wanted to see if I had any idea who I really was. Helena's face went white. You remember? But you showed no sign of recognition, no knowledge of the truth. Because I didn't know then, I replied. But Catherine knew. You had found me. She must have followed you, discovered who I was, and began her own investigation. She died trying to bring us together, trying to right the wrong you had done. The portfolio in Helena's hands suddenly burst into flames, causing her to drop it with a cry of shock. The papers scattered across the floor, some already consumed by the unnatural blue fire that seemed to burn without heat. I recognized Catherine's ghostly touch in this. Her determination that no evidence should remain except the truth we now knew. It's over, Aunt, Sebastian said, lowering his pistol slightly. We'll send for the authorities. You'll answer for your crimes. But Helena was beyond reason now, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames, seeing something in the shadows that made her face contort with terror. No, she whispered. They're all here. William, Thomas, Dr. Aldrich, Catherine. They're waiting for me. They want me to join them. Before either Sebastian or I could move, Helena turned and ran toward the window, the same window from which Catherine had fallen. But this time, there was no struggle, no accident. She threw herself through the already damaged glass with a force born of madness and guilt, her scream cutting through the night before ending with terrible finality. Sebastian lunged forward, but I caught his arm, holding him back. There was nothing to be done. Through my gift, I could see Helena's spirit already being pulled away, dragged into a darkness that had nothing to do with the peaceful light I usually saw waiting for the departed. The murdered dead had claimed their justice in their own way. We stood there in the tower room, surrounded by the burning remains of evidence and the lingering presence of spirits finally at peace. I felt Catherine's touch, gentle now, grateful, and then she was gone, truly gone this time, her purpose fulfilled. The other spirits faded too, including one I knew instinctively was my father, who seemed to pause beside me for just a moment, a warmth that felt like a blessing before dissolving into light. "She's dead," Sebastian said unnecessarily, staring at the broken window. "My aunt killed my wife, killed your father, destroyed so many lives, all for a title and fortune that was never rightfully ours." I turned to him, seeing the devastation in his eyes, the weight of guilt for crimes he hadn't committed but felt responsible for nonetheless. "None of this is your fault," I said firmly. "You were a child when my father died, an innocent when you married Catherine. You're as much a victim of Helena's crimes as anyone." He looked at me then, with such raw emotion that it took my breath away. "But don't you see? Everything I have, everything I am, is built on the murder of your father. The title I bear, the estate I inherited, the very clothes on my back, all of it should be yours. You're the rightful Duchess of Blackthorn, and I'm nothing but the son of a murderer and a coward." I stepped closer to him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cold room. "You're the man who sought justice for his wife, even when he didn't love her. You're the one who believed me when the truth seemed impossible. You're Sebastian, and that's all I need you to be." His hands came up to frame my face again, as they had in Catherine's room, but this time there was desperation in his touch. "Eleanor, we can't. We're cousins. Society would never accept it. The church would call it an abomination." I thought of Catherine's words in her journal, about Sebastian deserving to love freely, and understood suddenly what she had truly meant. She had known that bringing us together would create this terrible conflict between duty and desire, but she had also believed that love could transcend even the strictest social boundaries. "We're second cousins," I corrected, though the distinction seemed flimsy even to my own ears. "And more importantly, we're two people who have found each other through tragedy and truth. I've spent 3 years speaking with the dead, Sebastian, and if there's one thing they've taught me, it's that love is too precious and too rare to be dismissed for the sake of propriety." He pulled me against him then, and I went willingly, feeling the solid strength of his chest beneath my palms, inhaling the scent of him that had become as necessary as breathing. "We're playing with fire," he murmured against my hair. "Then let us burn," I whispered back, and lifted my face to his. The kiss was everything Catherine's journal had suggested she had never experienced with Sebastian, a meeting not just of lips, but of souls recognizing their match. I felt the world shift around us, as though the very foundations of Blackthorn Manor were rearranging themselves to accommodate this new truth. When we finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily, I saw in his eyes the same wonder I felt in my own heart. A sound from below broke the moment, voices and footsteps on the stairs. The servants had heard Helena's scream, were coming to investigate. Sebastian grabbed my hand, pulling me toward a different staircase, a servant's passage that led down the back of the tower. "We need to get you away from here before they arrive," he said urgently. "There will be questions, investigations. Your identity will be exposed, and you'll be in danger. There are others who benefited from your father's death, distant relatives who inherited portions of the estate that would be yours by right. If they learn you exist, then we face them together," I said, following him down the narrow stairs. "No more secrets, Sebastian. No more hiding. I've been Eleanor Ashwood, medium of Mayfair, for long enough. It's time to claim my true name, whatever the consequences." We emerged into a lesser-used part of the manor, and Sebastian led me quickly through passages I suspected few knew existed until we reached his private study. He locked the door behind us and immediately went to a hidden safe behind a portrait, extracting documents I recognized as those Catherine had mentioned in her journal. "These prove everything," he said, spreading them on his desk. "Your parents' marriage certificate, your birth record, letters that establish the timeline of events. With Helena's confession and these documents, we can petition the House of Lords to recognize your claim. But Eleanor, you need to understand what you're risking. The scandal will be enormous. Your reputation as a medium will be destroyed when people learn you're actually nobility. And our connection, what's growing between us, it will be fodder for every gossip in London." I moved around the desk to stand beside him, looking down at the proof of my true identity. "My whole life, I've been between worlds," I said softly. "Between the living and the dead, between the servants and the gentry, never truly belonging anywhere. But standing here with you, knowing the truth of who I am and what I feel, I finally understand where I belong." He turned to me, hope and fear warring in his expression. "And where is that?" I took his hand, threading our fingers together as naturally as breathing. "By your side, fighting for justice, claiming my birthright, and defying anyone who says our love is wrong." Catherine saw it, didn't she? She knew that bringing us together would create something stronger than scandal, more powerful than propriety. She gave us her blessing from beyond the grave. Sebastian pulled me into his arms, holding me as though I might disappear like the ghosts I communed with. "You're certain? Because once we start down this path, there's no turning back. The world will know who you are, what we are to each other, and they will judge us harshly." I thought of my mother dying in poverty, of my father poisoned by those he trusted, of Catherine falling through the storm, and of Helena's mad leap into darkness. So much death, so much pain, all to preserve a lie. But from those ashes, something new was rising, something that honored the dead while embracing life. "Let them judge," I said, lifting my chin with a pride I had never felt before. "I am Lady Eleanor Blackthorne, daughter of the 5th Duke of Blackthorne, and I choose love over fear, truth over propriety, and justice over silence. The dead have spoken, Sebastian, and they've given us their blessing. Who are we to refuse?" He kissed me again then, deeper this time, with a passion that spoke of promises and possibilities, of a future that would shock society but honor a deeper truth. When we finally drew apart, I saw in his eyes the same determination that had driven him to seek justice for a wife he hadn't loved, now transformed into something fiercer because this time it was personal. "Tomorrow we go to London," he said. "We file the papers, make your claim official, and face whatever comes. But tonight we plan, we strategize, we prepare for war, because that's what this will be, Eleanor. A war for your inheritance, for our right to be together, for the truth over decades of lies." I nodded, feeling the weight of destiny settling over me like a mantle. "Then we'd better win," I said, "for my father, for Catherine, for all the ghosts who've been waiting for justice." As if in response to my words, the gaslight in the study flared brighter, and I felt a presence I hadn't expected. Not Catherine this time, but older, warmer, infinitely loving. My mother's spirit, brief as a heartbeat, touching my cheek with ghostly fingers that felt like a benediction. Then she was gone, but her message was clear. She approved, she was proud, and she was finally at peace. The night stretched ahead of us, full of planning and preparation, but also full of something else, something that made my heart race and my spirit soar despite the dangers ahead. We had each other now, Sebastian and I, bound by blood and choice, by tragedy and truth, by a love that society would condemn, but that felt as inevitable as the sunrise. The medium of Mayfair was dead, but Lady Eleanor Blackthorne was very much alive, and she was ready to claim everything that had been stolen, including the heart of the man who should have been forbidden to her, but instead felt like coming home. The scandal broke across London society like a thunderclap on a clear day. Within a week of filing the petition with the House of Lords, every drawing room from Belgravia to Mayfair hummed with the delicious horror of it all. The mysterious medium who had comforted so many grieving aristocrats was actually one of them. The rightful Duchess of Blackthorn, denied her birthright by murder and conspiracy. And worse, far worse in the eyes of society's moral guardians, she was openly associating with her second cousin, Lord Blackthorn, in a manner that suggested something more than mere legal cooperation. I stood in the witness box at the Court of Chancery, my hand steady on the Bible despite the sea of avid faces staring up at me. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with journalists scribbling furiously and society matrons fanning themselves against the unseasonable November heat, generated by so many bodies pressed together in their eagerness to witness my destruction or vindication. "State your name for the record," the Lord Chancellor commanded, his ancient face impassive beneath his powdered wig. "I am Eleanor Margaret Blackthorn," I said clearly, my voice carrying to the furthest corners of the room. "Daughter of William James Blackthorn, 5th Duke of Blackthorn, and his lawful wife, Margaret Anne Blackthorn, née Ashwood." A ripple of whispers swept through the crowd, but I kept my eyes fixed on Sebastian, who sat in the front row of the gallery. He had been by my side through every moment of this ordeal, though we had been careful to maintain perfect propriety in public. Only in the private moments, in his study late at night as we prepared our case, did we allow ourselves the luxury of touch, of kisses stolen between legal documents, of promises whispered against each other's lips that we would survive this together. "You claim to have been raised in ignorance of your true parentage," the Lord Chancellor continued. "How then did you come to discover your identity?" "Through a séance, my lord," I replied, and waited for the inevitable reaction. "I was conducting a spiritual communication for Lord Sebastian Blackthorn, attempting to contact his late wife, Lady Catherine Blackthorn. During that séance, Lady Catherine's spirit revealed my true parentage and the circumstances of my father's death." The courtroom erupted. The Lord Chancellor had to call for order 3 times before the noise subsided to a level where he could continue. "You expect this court to accept spectral evidence, Miss Lady—" He fumbled over how to address me, the uncertainty itself a small victory. "I expect the court to accept the documentary evidence we have submitted," I said calmly. "The marriage certificate between my parents, my birth record, the letters between them, and the sworn testimony of 3 servants who remember my father and the circumstances of his death. The séance merely led us to discover these documents. The proof stands on its own merit. For 3 hours, they questioned me. About my childhood in poverty, about my mother's death, about my years as a medium. They tried to paint me as a fortune hunter, a charlatan who had somehow manufactured evidence to claim a title that wasn't mine. But I had spent 3 years learning to remain composed while channeling the voices of the dead. No pompous barrister could shake me more than a vengeful spirit could. The most difficult moment came when Lord Harrington, a distant cousin who stood to lose significant holdings if my claim was validated, rose to cross-examine me. "Tell me, Miss Ashwood, for that is how you've been known all your life, is it not true that you have been seen in compromising situations with Lord Blackthorn? That you've been residing at Blackthorn Manor without a proper chaperone? That your relationship with your supposed cousin exceeds the bounds of propriety?" I felt the trap closing, knowing that any answer I gave would be twisted. But before I could respond, Sebastian rose from his seat. "My Lord Chancellor," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade, "I request permission to address that accusation personally." The Lord Chancellor nodded, curiosity evident even on his weathered features. Sebastian moved to stand before the court, every inch the aristocrat in his perfectly tailored black coat, his bearing radiating the authority of centuries of breeding. "Lady Eleanor Blackthorn," he began, emphasizing my title in a way that made several observers shift uncomfortably, "has conducted herself with perfect propriety throughout these proceedings. Yes, she has resided at Blackthorn Manor in the same house where her father was murdered, under the protection of a full staff of servants and with Mrs. Pemberton, my late wife's companion, as her chaperone. If I have shown her particular attention, it is because she is my cousin, my family, and the victim of a terrible injustice that I am honor-bound to help correct." "And is that all she is to you?" Lord Harrington pressed, his smile sharp as a serpent's fang. "Your cousin and nothing more?" Sebastian turned to look at me, and in his eyes I saw him make a decision that would either damn us both or set us free. "No," he said simply. "She is not merely my cousin. She is the woman I intend to marry with the blessing of the church and the law, as is perfectly legal between second cousins in England. Our attachment formed not from any impropriety, but from a shared pursuit of justice and truth. If that offends your delicate sensibilities, Lord Harrington, I suggest you examine your own conscience regarding why you fight so hard to deny a woman her rightful inheritance." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Women fainted or pretended to. Journalists practically climbed over each other to get out and file their stories. The Lord Chancellor pounded his gavel repeatedly, threatening to clear the court entirely if order wasn't restored. Through it all, I kept my eyes on Sebastian, feeling such a surge of love and pride that I thought my heart might burst from my chest. When relative calm was finally restored, the Lord Chancellor fixed Sebastian with a stern gaze. "Lord Blackthorn, you understand that if Lady Eleanor's claim is validated, your own title becomes complicated? You would no longer be the Duke of Blackthorn." Sebastian didn't hesitate. "I understand perfectly, my lord. The title was never rightfully mine. It belongs to Lady Eleanor through her father, and I will gladly see justice done, regardless of the personal cost. Even if it means becoming simply Mr. Blackthorn," the Lord Chancellor pressed. "Even then," Sebastian confirmed, and I had to grip the witness box to keep from running to him. The proceedings continued for 3 more days. Witnesses were called, documents examined, family histories scrutinized. Mrs. Pemberton, Catherine's former companion, testified about the late Lady Blackthorn's investigation and her certainty about my identity. 3 elderly servants from Blackthorn Manor, who had served during my father's time, identified me as bearing an uncanny resemblance to the 5th Duke. Even the family physician, now in his 80s, was brought forward to testify about the suspicious nature of my father's illness all those years ago. But it was the final piece of evidence that turned the tide decisively. Sebastian's solicitor, Mr. Whitmore, produced a document none of us had known existed. Helena Blackthorn's written confession, penned in the hours before her death and hidden in her room, found only when the manor was searched after her suicide. In it, she detailed everything: the murder of my father, the suppression of my identity, the killing of Catherine. It was as though she had needed to unburden herself before facing whatever judgment awaited her in the next world. On the morning of November 20th, 1887, the Lord Chancellor rendered his decision. The court recognizes the legitimate claim of Eleanor Margaret Blackthorn to the title of Duchess of Blackthorn, all associated properties and accumulated revenues from the time of her father's death. Furthermore, the court acknowledges the validity of Lord Sebastian Blackthorn's stated intention to marry Lady Eleanor, finding no legal impediment to such a union between second cousins. I stood frozen as the words washed over me, unable to fully comprehend that we had won. It was Sebastian's hand on my elbow that brought me back to myself, his touch grounding me in reality, as it always did. The courtroom was in uproar again, but this time with a different energy. Some faces showed outrage, others calculation as they reconsidered their social strategies, and a few, surprisingly, showed genuine pleasure at seeing justice done. We left the courthouse through a gauntlet of journalists and curious onlookers. Questions were shouted from all directions, but Sebastian and I maintained dignified silence until we reached the carriage he had waiting. Only when the door closed behind us and the vehicle lurched into motion did I finally allow myself to collapse against him, my carefully maintained composure crumbling. "It's done," I whispered against his chest, feeling his arms come around me with a possessiveness that would have been scandalous in public, but felt perfectly right in private. "I'm officially Lady Eleanor Blackthorn. You always were," he murmured into my hair. "The court just finally recognized it. But Eleanor, you know this isn't over. Lord Harrington won't accept this quietly, and there are others who benefited from your father's death who will see you as a threat." I pulled back to look at him, seeing my own determination reflected in his eyes. Then we faced them together, as we've faced everything else. "But Sebastian, what about you? You've lost your title, your position. Because of me, you're no longer the Duke." He cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs stroking my cheekbones with infinite tenderness. I would give up a dozen titles for the right to call you my wife. Besides, I was never meant to be Duke. That was your birthright, stolen before you were born. I'm just grateful I get to be the man who stands beside you as you claim it. Even knowing what society will say? I asked. Even knowing we'll be the scandal of the decade, the cautionary tale mothers tell their daughters about the dangers of improper associations. He smiled then, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his austere features into something breathtaking. Especially then. Let them talk. Let them gossip and condemn and clutch their pearls in horror. We'll be too busy being happy to care. I kissed him then. There in the privacy of the moving carriage, with all the passion and promise I had been holding back during the long days of testimony. When we finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, I saw in his eyes the same hunger that had been building in me since that first night in my séance room. We should marry quickly, I said, trying to sound practical despite the heat in my cheeks. Before Lord Harrington can mount any legal challenges, before society can mobilize against us. Sebastian's smile turned wicked in a way that made my pulse race. How quickly? As soon as the bans can be read, I replied. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of torture, he groaned, pulling me closer. 3 weeks of maintaining propriety when all I want is to make you mine in every way possible. I shivered at his words, at the promise in them. Then we'd best start planning immediately. A small ceremony, I think. No need to give our critics more ammunition with a grand society wedding. Actually, he said, his expression turning thoughtful, I have a different idea. What if we married at Blackthorn Manor, in the same chapel where your parents were secretly wed? We have the documentation now. We know where it happened. It seems fitting, doesn't it? To honor their memory while claiming our own happiness? The idea was so perfect, so right, that tears sprang to my eyes. Yes, I breathed. Yes, that's exactly what we should do. Catherine would approve, I think. She brought us together, after all. The carriage pulled up outside Sebastian's London townhouse, which had become my temporary residence under the watchful eye of Mrs. Pemberton, and a full complement of servants to satisfy the proprieties. As we entered, the butler handed Sebastian a silver tray piled high with calling cards and invitations. Word has already spread, my lord, the butler said carefully. These arrived in just the past hour. Sebastian rifled through them quickly, then tossed the entire pile into the fireplace. We're not receiving visitors for the next 3 weeks, he announced. Anyone who wishes to call upon the Duchess of Blackthorn will have to wait until she's also Mrs. Sebastian Blackthorn. The servants exchanged glances that suggested this news was not entirely unexpected. Mrs. Pemberton, who had been waiting in the morning room, emerged with a knowing smile. I'll begin the wedding preparations immediately, Your Grace, she said to me, using my new title with evident satisfaction. Might I suggest we send to Paris for the dress? We want something that will make a statement. The statement I want to make, I said, is that love conquers all. That truth prevails over lies, that justice can be achieved even after decades of wrong, and that two people who choose each other are stronger than all the conventions society can throw at them. Mrs. Pemberton's smile widened. Then we'll definitely need the Paris dress. The next 3 weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparation and strategic planning. We filed additional legal documents to secure my inheritance, dealt with increasingly desperate attempts by Lord Harrington to challenge the court's decision, and planned a wedding that would be small in size but enormous in significance. Through it all, Sebastian and I maintained perfect propriety in public while stealing moments of passion in private. Each kiss, each touch, a promise of what was to come. The night before our wedding, I stood in what had been Catherine's room at Blackthorn Manor, looking out at the East Tower, where so much tragedy had occurred. Tomorrow, I would marry Sebastian in the chapel, where my parents had exchanged their secret vows. Tomorrow, I would fully claim my birthright as Duchess of Blackthorn. But tonight, I was simply Eleanor, a woman in love, standing on the precipice of a new life. A knock at the door interrupted my reverie. I opened it to find Sebastian standing there, looking somewhat sheepish. I know it's bad luck to see the bride before the wedding, he said, but I had to give you this tonight. He handed me a small velvet box. Inside was a ring I recognized from the family portraits, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds that had belonged to Sebastian's mother. But more than that, I realized, It had originally belonged to my grandmother, the fourth Duke's wife, the ring that should have passed to my father's bride if history had been allowed to unfold properly. "It's finally come to its rightful owner," Sebastian said softly, "like everything else that was stolen from you." I slipped the ring onto my right hand, saving the left for tomorrow's wedding band. "Not everything was stolen," I said, looking up at him with all the love I felt shining in my eyes. "If my life had gone differently, if I had been raised as Lady Eleanor from birth, I might never have developed my gift. I might never have been the one you came to that night seeking Catherine's spirit. We might never have found each other." He pulled me into his arms. "Propriety be damned. Then thank God for thieves and murderers," he murmured against my lips, "because I would rather have found you this way than never have found you at all." We kissed there in the doorway, a kiss full of promise and passion, of sorrow for all that had been lost, and joy for all that had been found. Tomorrow we would face society's judgment, but tonight we were simply two souls who had found their match despite impossible odds, brought together by a ghost who knew that love was stronger than death, stronger than scandal, stronger than all the forces that would try to tear us apart. When Sebastian finally pulled away, his eyes were dark with desire and bright with love. "Tomorrow," he promised. "Tomorrow," I agreed, and watched him walk away, counting the hours until I could call him husband, until the medium of Mayfair would complete her transformation into the Duchess of Blackthorn, wife of the man who had lost a title but gained something infinitely more precious, a love worth defying heaven and earth to claim. The morning of my wedding dawned crystal clear and unseasonably warm for late November, as though the weather itself had decided to bless our unconventional union. I stood before the mirror in my mother's wedding dress, which Sebastian had somehow recovered from the belongings my father had hidden away before his death. The ivory silk had yellowed slightly with age, but Mrs. Pemberton had worked miracles with careful cleaning and fresh lace from Paris. As I looked at my reflection, I could almost see my mother standing beside me, finally able to witness her daughter claim both her birthright and her heart's desire. The chapel at Blackthorn Manor had been closed for 20 years, but Sebastian had spent the past week having it restored to its former glory. As I walked down the aisle on the arm of Mr. Whitmore, our solicitor who had agreed to give me away, I saw that every surface gleamed, every stained glass window sparkled with morning light, and white roses from the manor's greenhouse filled the air with their perfume. It was a small gathering by society's standards, just 20 guests who had proven themselves true friends by attending despite the scandal. But it was perfect. Sebastian stood at the altar in his morning coat, his dark eyes fixed on me with such intensity that everyone else in the chapel seemed to fade away. Beside him stood his closest friend from university, Lord Pemberton, one of the few who had remained loyal when Sebastian chose love over convention. As I approached, I saw Sebastian's hands tremble slightly, the only sign of the emotion he was keeping carefully controlled. The vicar, an elderly man who had known my father in his youth and had been appalled to learn of his murder, began the ceremony with unusual warmth in his voice. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness something extraordinary, not merely the union of two souls, but the triumph of truth over deception, of love over prejudice, and of justice delayed but not denied." When we reached the vows, Sebastian took my hands in his, and I felt the same electric connection that had sparked between us from the very beginning. His voice was steady and clear as he spoke the ancient words, but when he reached the promise to love and cherish, his voice broke slightly with emotion that made my own eyes fill with tears. "I, Eleanor Margaret Blackthorn," I said when my turn came, "take thee, Sebastian James Blackthorn, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." As I spoke the words, I felt a presence in the chapel that made the hair on my arms rise, not frightening this time, but peaceful, joyful even. Catherine was here. I knew it with the certainty that came from years of speaking with the dead, but she wasn't alone. My parents were here too, and Sebastian's mother, and all the souls who had been wronged but could now rest, knowing justice had been done and love had triumphed. When the vicar pronounced us husband and wife, Sebastian kissed me with a passion that would have been scandalous if our entire courtship hadn't already scandalized society beyond redemption. The small gathering erupted in genuine applause, and as we turned to face them as husband and wife, I saw Mrs. Pemberton dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, Mr. Whitmore beaming with paternal pride, and even Lord Pemberton looking suspiciously moved. The wedding breakfast was held in the main hall of Blackthorn Manor, the same room where portraits of my ancestors looked down from the walls. Sebastian had arranged for my father's portrait, hidden away for decades, to be restored to its rightful place. As we entered the hall as husband and wife, I stopped before it, seeing for the first time the face of the man who had given me life, but never had the chance to know me. "He would be proud," Sebastian murmured in my ear. "You've reclaimed everything that was stolen, and found love in the process." "We've reclaimed it," I corrected, turning in his arms. "None of this would have been possible without you. You gave up your title, risked your reputation, faced the censure of society, all for me." He smiled, that private smile I had come to treasure. "I gained far more than I lost. I may no longer be the Duke, but I'm the husband of the most remarkable woman in England. I'd say that's a significant improvement in status." The breakfast was a joyous affair, with toasts that celebrated not just our marriage, but the righting of historical wrongs. Lord Pemberton, somewhat worse for champagne, gave a speech that had everyone laughing about Sebastian's transformation from London's most eligible but aloof bachelor to a man so desperately in love he was willing to testify before the entire House of Lords about it. As the afternoon wore on and our guests began to depart, each offering congratulations and promises to defend us against society's gossips, Sebastian drew me aside. "I have a wedding gift for you," he said, producing a heavy brass key from his pocket. I looked at it curiously. "What does it open?" He led me through the manor to a wing I had never explored, up a narrow staircase to a heavy oak door that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. "This was your father's private study," he explained, fitting the key in the lock. "Helena had it sealed after his death, claimed it was structurally unsound, but I had builders examine it last week. There's nothing wrong with it. She just didn't want anyone finding what was inside." The door opened to reveal a beautiful circular room at the top of what I realized was the West Tower, the mirror opposite of the East Tower where Catherine had died. But while that space had been dark and tragic, this was filled with light from windows on all sides. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, scientific instruments covered various tables, and in the center sat a massive desk covered in papers that looked as though they had been abandoned mid-thought. "Your father was a Renaissance man," Sebastian said, watching as I moved through the room with wonder. "Science, literature, philosophy, social reform. These are all his writings, his work. Helena couldn't bring herself to destroy it, but she couldn't let anyone see it either. It's yours now, all of it. Your inheritance isn't just a title and estate, Eleanor. It's a legacy of progressive thought and intellectual curiosity." I picked up one of the journals, opening it to find my father's handwriting, strong and confident. The entry was about his vision for using the Blackthorn fortune to establish schools for the working class, to fund scientific research, to support artists and writers regardless of their social standing. These were the radical ideas Helena had mentioned with such disdain, the dreams she had murdered him to prevent. "We could still do this," I said, looking up at Sebastian with growing excitement. "We could use the fortune to fulfill his vision. Schools, hospitals, support for scientific advancement. We could make the Blackthorn name stand for progress instead of privilege." Sebastian pulled me into his arms, his eyes shining with admiration. "Have I mentioned that I love your revolutionary spirit as much as I love everything else about you?" "Not in the last hour," I teased, standing on my toes to kiss him. When we finally left the study, the sun was setting, painting the manor in shades of gold and rose. We walked hand in hand to the East Tower, to the room where Catherine had met her death and Helena had confessed her crimes. The broken window had been repaired, and someone, probably Mrs. Pemberton, had placed a vase of white roses on the sill. "Do you think she's at peace now?" Sebastian asked, knowing I would understand he meant Catherine. I closed my eyes, extending my supernatural senses into the space around us. The tower felt different than it had weeks ago. The oppressive weight of secrets and sorrow had lifted, replaced by something lighter, almost hopeful. "She's gone on," I said with certainty. "Her work here was finished the moment we said our vows. She brought us together, exposed the truth, and saw justice done. She's free now, truly free." Sebastian pulled me closer, and we stood together watching the sun sink toward the horizon. "What about your gift?" he asked. "Will you continue conducting séances now that you're the Duchess of Blackthorn?" I considered the question carefully. My gift hasn't gone away just because my circumstances have changed. If anything, understanding my true heritage has made it stronger. Perhaps I could use it differently now, helping solve crimes, finding lost souls, bringing peace to the restless dead. Not for money, but for justice. The Duchess of Blackthorn, consulting medium to Scotland Yard. Can you imagine the scandal? He laughed, the sound rich and warm in the cooling air. I can imagine the headlines. But more importantly, I can imagine you being brilliant at it, using both your supernatural gift and your natural intelligence to help those who need it most. It's what your father would have wanted, I think. Progressive, unconventional, dedicated to justice. As if in response to his words, I felt a warmth wash over me. A presence that was there and gone in an instant. My father's spirit, offering his blessing one last time before moving on to wherever souls go when their earthly concerns are finally resolved. I knew with absolute certainty that I would never feel his presence again, that this was his final goodbye. That night, our wedding night, as Sebastian and I finally came together as husband and wife in the master suite of Blackthorn Manor, I understood that every tragedy, every loss, every moment of pain had led to this perfect union. We loved each other not despite the forbidden nature of our connection, but because of it, because we had chosen each other over everything society said was proper and right. In the weeks that followed, the scandal of our marriage did indeed rock London society. There were those who cut us dead in the street, who whispered behind fans about the impropriety of cousins marrying, about the presumption of a common medium claiming a duchess's title. But there were others, more than we had expected, who admired our courage, who saw in our story a triumph of love over convention, of truth over comfortable lies. Lord Harrington made one last attempt to challenge my inheritance, claiming that my years as a medium had rendered me unfit for noble status. The challenge was dismissed so quickly and decisively that he retreated to his country estate and wasn't seen in London for 2 years. Other distant relatives who had benefited from my father's murder quietly returned properties and funds that should have been mine, not out of guilt, but out of fear that I might use my supernatural connections to haunt them. The thought had never occurred to me, but I didn't correct their misapprehension. Within 6 months, we had established the William Blackthorn Foundation for Scientific Advancement and Social Reform, fulfilling my father's vision with Sebastian's enthusiastic support. We funded schools in the East End, supported female physicians and scientists, and sponsored expeditions to advance human knowledge. The same society that had gasped in horror at our marriage now had to acknowledge the good we were doing with the Blackthorn fortune. But it was a morning nearly a year after our wedding when everything came full circle. I woke feeling nauseated, a sensation that had been plaguing me for several days. When the family physician confirmed what I had suspected, I found Sebastian in my father's study, now our shared sanctuary, where we worked side by side on the Foundation's projects. "I have news," I said, moving to stand beside his chair. He looked up from the scientific journal he'd been reading, immediately alert to the emotion in my voice. "What is it? Has someone else challenged your claim? Has there been another ghostly manifestation?" I took his hand and placed it on my still flat stomach. "In about 7 months, there's going to be a new heir to the Blackthorn legacy. One conceived in love, born into truth, and raised with all the advantages my father wanted for his children." The joy that spread across Sebastian's face was like sunshine after a storm. He pulled me into his lap, holding me as though I was made of spun glass. "A child," he breathed against my hair. "Our child. Living proof that love conquers all obstacles." "I thought of Catherine then," I said softly. "How different things might have been if she'd been able to have children. Would she still have investigated my father's death? Would she still have brought us together?" Sebastian was quiet for a moment, his hand still resting protectively over our unborn child. "I think she knew," he said finally. "Even before she found the documents, before she discovered your existence. I think she knew our marriage was wrong, built on a foundation of lies and murder. She chose to sacrifice herself to make things right, to give us the chance at happiness she never had. In a way, this child is her legacy, too." I curled into his embrace, feeling perfectly content for perhaps the first time in my life. The ghosts were at peace, the truth had been revealed, justice had been served, and love had indeed conquered all. The medium of Mayfair had kept her promise never to love a client, but Eleanor Blackthorne had found something far greater. A love that transcended death, defied society, and created new life from the ashes of old tragedies. As I sat in my husband's arms, our child growing within me, surrounded by my father's books and dreams, I knew that every spirit I had ever communicated with had been leading me to this moment. The dead had their own ways of ensuring justice, of bringing together souls meant to be united, of turning curses into blessings. 3 years ago, I had sworn never to love a client. I had built walls around my heart, convinced that maintaining professional distance was the key to survival in a world that barely accepted my existence. But Catherine Blackthorne, speaking from beyond the grave, had called me my lady and changed everything. She had known that some loves are worth breaking all the rules for, that some truths are worth dying to reveal, and that sometimes the greatest gift the dead can give the living is permission to choose happiness over propriety. Our story would be told for generations, I knew. The scandal of the decade would become the romance of the century. But for now, in this perfect moment, we were simply Sebastian and Eleanor, two souls who had found each other through séances and secrets, through murder and mystery, through a love that society called forbidden, but heaven had clearly ordained. The morning sun streamed through the windows of my father's study, illuminating dust motes that danced like celebrating spirits in the golden light. And perhaps they were. Perhaps all the ghosts who had guided us to this moment were dancing with joy at seeing their labors bear fruit. The medium of Mayfair had learned the most important lesson of all, that love, true love, is the only force powerful enough to bridge the gap between the living and the dead, between what society demands and what the heart knows to be true. My name is Eleanor Margaret Blackthorne, Duchess of Blackthorne, wife of Sebastian James Blackthorne, mother of the child who will carry on a legacy of truth and justice. I still speak with the dead when they have something important to say, but now I know that their most crucial message has always been the same. Choose love, choose truth, choose happiness, for life is too brief and death too long to waste time on anything less than absolute devotion to what makes your soul sing. And mine sings every time Sebastian looks at me, every time our child moves within me, every time I stand in these rooms where my father once dreamed of a better world. The ghosts are quiet now, their work complete, but their blessing remains, woven into every moment of this life we've built from the ruins of their tragedies. We are their redemption, their justice, their happily ever after, finally achieved.